All right, welcome to this episode of Phototheology, and I'm your host, Doug, and today we're going to be looking at the Canon EOS 6D, and it's going to be paired up against the Canon EOS T5i, the Canon EOS 5D Mark III, and the Fuji, the X Pro 1. So, before we begin, let me say the parameters of how this test works. This test is a little different from some of the tests that we've done in the past. And the reasoning for this is that I'm wanting to show the overall potential of the camera in terms of its image quality. Now, what you're going to be looking at here in this video is you are going to be looking at the baseline exposure point, and then you're also going to be looking at the optimal exposure point. Okay, so basically low point, high point in terms of the camera's overall dynamic range, and also what will be factored into this based on how Corel does its system is it is a rebalancing of the sensor, which is very important to understand, is that we are talking about where the sensor is completely balanced for its colors, its tones, its white balance, its hues, all of the above, along with its saturations. But you have a high point and you have a low point, or you have a base point and you have an optimal point. And in this video, you are going to see the potential, the baseline potential, as well as the optimal potential of what the camera can do. As far as the Canon EOS, 6D goes, the 5D Mark III, along with the T5i and the Fuji, the X Pro 1. Now, each camera is here for a certain reason, okay? It's really important to understand where this test is going to be coming from. And this test is based on the fact that if you are a person who is now looking to upgrade your camera, if you're a person who is now looking to expand your photography and you believe that the gear is what you need in order to take you there, then this is going to be the kind of test that I do that's going to be for you. So primarily we're going to be concentrating on the Canon EOS 6D, and the reason why we're going to be concentrating on that is because right now it is speaking to the market in a way that most other cameras are not. And let me explain this. So one of the main things that you have going on right now in the camera market is you have the concept of an entry-level full-frame system. Now, this is primarily done by Nikon and Canon. Canon has their 6D, Nikon has their D600. But the idea behind this is a very simple idea, which deals with the fact of the consumer actually being able to further their photography through having a more advanced camera system, which is your full frame system. Now, I am not saying that that is necessarily the case, but in the way most people perceive full frame cameras, there is a general assumption that when you go full frame, you get a more advanced camera, a more robust camera, and most importantly, you get a camera that actually produces a better image. Now, because of this theory, what I've done is I've taken the Mark III, which stands as the Premier, and it's in the upper left corner. Then in the upper right corner is your Canon 6D. In your lower left corner is the Canon T5i, and then in the lower right corner is the Fuji X Pro 1. So from a full frame aspect, what we're able to do here in this video is we're actually able to examine the Canon 6D's overall image quality and its baseline image architecture in comparison to a compact SLR sensor, which would be the Canon T5i, and also we're able to pair it up against a ideal full frame based camera, which is the Canon 5D Mark III. Now, the reason why the Fuji X Pro 1 is here in this conversation is a very simple reason. It comes down to Fuji is a sensor manufacturer, and when it comes to lighting, they are considered to be the best or one of the best, depending on how you feel about Fuji. But also, the reason why they're here is because they offer a different style of camera system, which is your mirrorless compact base sensor camera system. So one thing that's important to understand is when we're talking, about this idea of furthering your photography, of becoming a better photographer, under whatever circumstances, you find yourself in that, basically forces you in that direction, or forces you to feel that you need to go in that direction, so that you can become, what you want to become. The full frame system is one type of system that you're able to look at. But another type of system, which is equally as competitive now, is the mirrorless frame system. Now, the whole reason why Canon and Nikon are developing entry-level full-frame cameras, in other words, these are cameras that are full-frame in nature that clock in at about $2,000, is because Nikon and Canon have been dismal, absolutely just atrocious when it comes to the compact camera arena in terms of compact SLRs. The reasoning for this is actually quite simple. The first thing is Nikon and Canon have a great investment in, traditional style of SLRs. You talk about lens mounts, you talk about technology, you talk about marketing and all of the above. I mean, let's face it, their bread and their butter is their full-size SLR market. But Nikon and Canon have been, under siege by units like the Sony NEX, the Samsung NX. You've got, of course, the Olympus, not the Olympus, but the, you do have the Olympus pen. But you also have, I want to say, the Panasonic Lumix series. You've got, Fuji's X Pro 1 series, and I could go on and on and on, okay, about compact camera types, okay, or compact SLR camera types, all right. Those are just, I want to say, baseline brands with baseline models. You're not even talking about the specific, models within each subcategory of what I've just mentioned. Now, why is this important? Okay, because you might be thinking, all right, well, you know what, so mirrorless cameras are pretty popular. What difference does that make? Well, it makes a huge difference in terms of the camera market, because a mirrorless camera can clock in with 24 megapixels. A mirrorless camera can shoot 10 to 12 frames a second, depending on who we're talking about. A mirrorless camera can shoot 1080 60p video without any motor noise. A mirrorless camera can do a ton of different things that a traditional SLR, based on years of marketing and whatnot, simply just doesn't have the ability to do. So you're typically not going to find a traditional SLR under $2,000 unless we're talking Sony. Okay, so Sony's a little different from this rule, but unless we're talking Sony, you're not really going to find a traditional style of SLR that's going to shoot 10 to 12 frames a second. That's not going to happen. Now, Sony will do it, but Sony's still using a mirrorless camera system in the overall scheme of things in order to make those kind of things happen. So that's something that I do want to point out there. So you can see where Nikon and Canon are coming from. These guys understand that the camera landscape is shifting, that people have options. And the option that Canon is betting on is the Canon EOS 6D. Now, the reasoning for this is because the foundation is already there for Canon. Just think about it. You're talking about full frame. Everybody knows what full frame is who knows anything about photography. Everybody knows the concept behind full frame is supposed to be equivalent to a classic film setup when you dumb it down. So when people invest in digital cameras, it's generally believed that a digital picture cannot be as good as what a film picture is. Now, to tell you the truth, that honestly depends on, I want to say, the camera that we're talking about. It also depends on, I want to say, the manufacturer, their color system, their system for dynamic range, and a whole slew of other things, okay, that you'd have to factor into it before you could actually make that claim. But in terms of general belief, which is the main thing that we're talking about here, okay, just general belief. It is generally believed that full frame is equal to classic film. That is the general belief. So Canon has decided to basically further that narrative. And the way that they further the narrative is they've decided to produce their Canon 6D. The idea behind the 6D is that it's able to take that person who wants to further their photography, who wants to basically take themselves to a greater level or to a higher playing field. But it allows them to work within a price bracket that is acceptable to them. This is the main marketing concept behind the camera on the baseline. Now, going beyond that with the Canon 6D, the Canon 6D actually has two major features that are very important. And we're going to talk about a couple of features and the way you want to look at the camera before we actually get into the image quality. Reason for this is that as I'm talking, you're obviously looking at the image, so I mean you can start making your own assessments before I even mention a word. But there are two things that Canon's doing with the Canon 6D which makes it revolutionary within the Canon family. The first thing is you're able to geotag your pictures with the GPS, built-in camera GPS. This means that, if you're a person who does a lot of nature photography, or if you're a person who does a lot of, we'll say, vacational stuff and things of that nature, what happens is you're able to, pop off your shots, and then, time, date, location, everything's actually there. The second thing, which is more important though, is this camera actually has Wi-Fi capability. Now, for those of you who are Samsung users, Wi-Fi is big. In fact, right now, when it comes to cameras and when it comes to Wi-Fi, Samsung is like #1 in terms of Wi-Fi development and in terms of Wi-Fi applications and things like that. And Canon's looking to bring that Wi-Fi experience to their SLR lineup now. And the Canon 6D is the first camera to actually have true integrated Wi-Fi into their camera. Now, the benefits to the idea of Wi-Fi are actually pretty great. So, for example, you want to have a wireless remote, use your cell phone. Heck, you can even see exactly what the picture looks like before you even take the picture. That's how Samsung NX cameras work, for example. They have an ability where they can actually integrate with their phone. Another cool advantage with having Wi-Fi is that you can use it as a form of tethering. So, let's say you need to have a bigger screen to see your stuff on. Well, all of a sudden I can, Wi-Fi my camera to my tablet, use the Wi-Fi capability, and poof, I have a bigger screen. So if my ass is going blind, guess what? I can now look at something on a 10-inch versus a 3-inch, that kind of thing. And there are a number of other applications in which you could sit up here and look at the Wi-Fi and see where the sky is the limit. Same thing for video and for, other things as well. Now, the Wi-Fi concept is very new with Canon. I mean, keep in mind, this is a first generation Wi-Fi, system. So from that perspective, I wouldn't put too much hope into it. Okay, I mean, truthfully, if you are wanting an SLR and if you want to have Wi-Fi, then honestly, the brand I'd be telling you to go with right now, even though I don't even have them in this discussion part, is Samsung. They're definitely the best when it comes to Wi-Fi, hands down. They are the very best. But stepping away from Wi-Fi, let's look at the general build of the camera, because I think that part's very important. The first thing is this, is that the Canon 6D has 11 autofocusing points. Now, why is this important? Well, when you spin the extra 1,000 plus on a Canon 5D Mark III, you get 61 autofocusing points. So literally, when you're talking about a Canon 6D versus a Canon 5D Mark III, for the difference in price between the two, you do the math. You're talking 50 more autofocusing points, which is pretty steep. And if we were to compare it to the Canon T5i, well, you get a couple more autofocusing points than the Canon T5i. Canon T5i, which is the premier Canon Rebel right now, only has 9 autofocusing points. And if we were talking about the Fuji X Pro, which is a mirrorless system, you've got about, 49 autofocusing points clocking in there. Now, right there, some of you may say, wait a second here, I'm spending $2,000 on a camera that essentially only has 11 autofocusing points. What gives? Well, the reason why it runs that way is because Canon is trying out a brand new concept with the Canon 6D, which is a lower exposure capability in terms of being able to autofocus. So, like the Pentax K5 II and the K5 IIs, the Canon 6D actually can shoot in a -3 exposure setup. This is pretty impressive, except for one thing. The camera itself does have issues when it comes to shallow contrast and shallow contrast with shallow saturations. So the camera is very picky when it comes to photographing. In other words, your subject matter has to be well defined within the light parameters and with, the kind of contrast and whatnot that are taking place in the scene for the camera to be able to lock on and then take the shot. Now, if you're looking at the Rebel or the Fuji or the T5i, I'm sorry, not the T5i, but the 5D Mark III, those cameras at best shoot at a -2 exposure. So Canon's attitude here is this: listen, you know what? We may only give you 11 autofocusing points, but the one thing that we need to point out in this situation, or in this discussion, is the fact that you can shoot at a -3 exposure where other cameras only shoot at a -2 exposure. Effectively, what this means is that you don't need to have an autofocus assist. That's the whole idea behind this. Now, in the past when I've talked about this, I've always talked about this as a plus. Here, to tell you the truth, I'm a little iffy on this. And the reason for this is that it deals more with the fact of downgrading an autofocusing system simply to add in an autofocusing feature. So this brings us to the next thing about the Canon 6D, which is its autofocusing speed. The Canon 6D's autofocusing speed is honestly just astounding. It comes in at a 0.29. Now, when I said astounding, you might have sat up here and thought I was talking about in a good way. No, I mean like in a craptacular way. A 0.29 is utterly just sad. Comparing it to its higher end brother, the 5D Mark III, you're talking about a 0.12. That means it's more than the 5D Mark III in terms of autofocusing speed is twice as fast. Actually, it's more than twice as fast. And if you're talking about the Canon, the T5i, you're looking at roughly a 0.25, which is, again, faster than the 0.29 on the Canon 6D. And then if we're talking about the Fuji, well, the Fuji can even, depending on the lens, the Fuji clocks in at a 0.1. Now, once again, let's think about what we've been talking about here for a moment. So we're talking about changing camera systems. But also when you're changing a camera system, you're also changing your expectations. So if I'm a person who's been shooting with a Rebel, and let's say, for example, I'm using this Canon, T5i. Marginally moving up in autofocusing points, it's kind of a plus to have a minus, 3 exposure. That's a plus there. But the autofocusing speed, the fact that the camera actually autofocuses a little bit slower, not really feeling that. Not feeling that at all. So then the next thing we move to is your frames per second. Now, the Canon 6D has 4.5 frames per second. The Canon 5D Mark III, 6 frames per second. Of course, the Canon T5i comes in at 5, and the Fuji X Pro 1 comes in at 6. So by no means is this thing a speed demon. But if you're trying to photograph someone walking around, or if you're trying to photograph more or less still subject matter, you're going to be okay. You'll be just fine. If we're talking kids, out of the question, sports, not happening. But yeah, we'll simply say if someone's strolling around, or if we're talking still, still subject matter, then you're perfectly fine there. So when it comes to speed, once again, this is a really interesting thing with the Canon, because when you're talking about the speed of the camera, understand that that frame and a half, that frame and a half that you lose for that $1,000 in price difference between, the Canon, 6D and the Mark III is a pretty hefty thing. But the other thing that you also have to keep in mind is that this is one of the gambles that Canon's actually making here. Remember what I said earlier about compact mirrorless SLR systems, where you have cameras shooting as fast as 10 to 12 frames. So to do effectively less than half of that really does make you wonder where Canon's coming from with this. It's understandable that Canon does not want the 6D to overtake the Mark III. But I do think on the frames per second, this is where Canon totally botched it. If you were going to have a lower autofocusing speed, and if you were going to have inferior autofocusing points. The -3 exposure thing doesn't really help you out there, simply just due to the fact of the camera's natural inferiority to be able to assess a situation and say, here, in weaker contrast scenarios, I can grab this subject. So autofocusing, it's not a strong point of the camera. But in terms of frames per second, and I think this is where they ended up making the mistake. I think this is a case where the camera should have been 7 frames a second versus the 6. This way, it's a more attractive buy for the camera. And it allows the camera to be perceived more as a sports camera. So for example, if I had a Canon 7D, or if I had a Canon 60D, then this 6D would make sense to go to. So I do think that having 4.5 frames per second in no way, shape, or form helps this camera. I think this is one of the biggest things that actually hurts the camera. I think 7 frames would have been a smart thing there, but hey, the camera is what it is. So we'll move on from that. So the next thing that you're looking at is ISO performance. And when it comes to ISO performance, I think this is where things get a little interesting. Because when you're talking about the ISO performance of the camera, this is where the camera really shines. Anybody who's buying a full frame camera should be doing it for the ISO performance. In other words, it's all about the ability to push the sensor's light range and at the same time still keep a solid image integrity. One area where the Canon 6D does not fail is on its ISO performance. It is clear that if you compare it to the T5i, the Canon 6D after our 3200 ISO utterly crushes the T5i. There's no two ways about that. I mean, it utterly just crushes it. So, in no way, shape, or form is Canon allowing their Rebel series to interfere with the full frame series that they've got going on. Back when the 60D was made, and you had the 5D, the 5D Mark II, there wasn't really that big of a difference there in terms of ISO performance. In fact, I would challenge anybody to really point that out. There really wasn't. But since the introduction of the 5D Mark II, and since Canon has switched over to the Digix 5 processor, one of the big advantages to the Digix 5 processor is the Digix 5 processor does extremely well when it comes to dynamic range and whatnot. But also what the Digix 5 processor is designed to do is, aside from amplifying a camera's natural dynamic range, what the Digix 5 processor is also able to do is it's able to properly gauge the colors and saturations and all of the above within that dynamic range spectrum, provided the camera is tooled towards that, which we'll be talking about that a little bit later here. But where Rebels completely fall off in this conversation, whether it's the T4i, whether it's the T5i, is it comes down to, I want to say, the ISO. After 3200 ISO, poof, the thing's done. And going even into 6400 ISO, the Canon 6D is extremely strong. In fact, it's basically as strong as the Canon 5D Mark III. So for the 2000, you will be getting full frame ISO performance from Canon's perspective. Now, one other thing though I have to simply point out for the money is that when we're talking $2,000, okay, and remember, I did say that the Fuji was here as an alternative system. Look at the ISO performance of the Fuji. The Fuji's ISO performance is actually better than both the Canon 5D Mark III and the Canon the 6D. If you're looking at overall ISO performance, I would totally give it to the Fuji in comparison to the other guys. And that is not a full frame system. Now, one of the reasons why Fuji does so well with their ISO performance is because they have their X-Trans sensor along with a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm not going to get into because this is not a review about the Fuji, but it's about a conversational piece about the Canon 6D, where the Fuji basically just has, we'll say, the edge over the other guys, okay, for the sake of the conversation. That's what we'll say in this case. But for those people who are looking at this and saying, okay, well, all right, the Canon 6D has good ISO performance, it has GPS, it has Wi-Fi, mechanically, it's a little weak there. What's the bottom line to this camera? What is the bottom line to it? Well, my bottom line to it is the image quality. And this is what separates the 6D from the 5D Mark III. If you have been going through this video while I've been talking, and if you have been looking at the two cameras, the 5D Mark III on the left and the 6D on the right, you notice there is a world of difference in the image quality. The reason comes down to this. The fact is, you're only spending $2,000 from Canon's perspective. And when Canon made the 6D, rather than concentrating on image quality, what they decided to do was concentrate on features. Understand, mechanically, the camera is inferior. And also understand, image quality-wise, and we're about to go into this, the camera is lacking there too. But the whole point behind the camera is it's about the GPS, and it's about the Wi-Fi, and it's about the -3 exposure capability. Those three things are what primarily make the 6D what it is, along with the fact that you can say it's a full frame, even though the viewfinder is only like 97% coverage or something silly like that. But when you talk about the camera's actual image quality, this is where the camera actually takes the biggest knock. Part of it comes down to this. The Canon 6D is not a fine-tuned camera. If you look at it mechanically, you can make the argument that it's a rebel. But when you look at it from an image quality standpoint, you can definitely say that if we're talking about it minus the ISO aspect, that it is definitely a rebel in nature. Now, here's the way you have to look at the 6D, which is this. You're gaining ISO performance. So what you do, in turn, is you lose the color system. You gain dynamic range. So in turn, you lose your color saturation. In other words, every single thing that you gain, you are going to lose something in another respect. That's how it works. So remember, when we talked about autofocusing, okay, you lose on autofocusing speed, but you gain a -3 exposure. You lose on your frames per second, but you gain on your ISO capability. And here with the color system that we're going to be looking at, because we're pretty far into this now, this is where things really show. So the first thing is this, is the Canon 6D definitely has a color management problem. If you were looking at reds, reds look like they're burgundy, or even worse, in some cases, they look like they could be conceived as orange. And that's just the standpoint. That's just from a standpoint of reds. The blues are a completely different tone than any other camera, and in addition to that, the blues are heavily oversaturated. The whites with the camera simply just bleed through. And what it comes down to is the fact that the camera is highly, and I mean highly, compromised when it comes to its native image quality. Now keep in mind here that Corel rebalances the sensor. And also keep in mind that these images have been interpolated so that they actually match the resolution. And by images, I'm talking here for a moment the Canon T5i and the Fuji X Pro 1, so that they actually match the Canon 6D in terms of resolution. But even if you want to compare the Canon 6D over to the Canon T5i, even if we were to make that comparison, okay, understand we're taking an entry-level full-frame Canon and we're comparing it to a high-end Rebel. If we want to make that comparison, we can go right ahead and make that. That is definitely not a problem here. When it comes to the color tones, the Canon T5i is better. Although it is a Rebel, it is still better when it comes to color tones. The way Canon is able to manage the coloring system on the Canon T5i is there is a degree of undersaturation, which is pretty obvious. But the colors are more true, even though they are duller. This is one of the downfalls to actually owning a Rebel, which is you gain a ton of dynamic range, but on the flip side of things, you know, with a higher end Rebel like the T5i, you end up losing the saturations that are needed in order to bring the colors through the dynamic range that the Digix 5 processor actually offers. On the flip side of this though, once again, let's look at the Fuji. The Fuji's color system is virtually dead on. Also, the Fuji has the best dynamic range. Once again, the Fuji's not actually using a full frame sensor. Now, when you look at the Fuji, and when you look at the Canon T5i, you'll notice that although the colors are somewhat similar, the Fuji's colors come through the exposure. Once again, looking at the 6D, you can see how your whites have a yellowish tint to them. You can also see how, you know, reds are burgundies, how lighter blues are deeper blues, and all sorts of craziness is going on in terms of that color system. Comparing the Fuji to the Canon 5D Mark III, you can see that the Fuji and the Canon 5D Mark III are virtually identical for the sake of this conversation. So when we talk about the Canon 6D, understand when we talk about the hues, when we talk about the saturations, when we talk about the colors, when we talk about the tones, the camera takes a severe hit there. But even going beyond that, one of the things that the Canon 6D lacks, and this runs into the whole concept of color and image, is it actually lacks an auto white balance corrector. Now, I find this to be amazing, and here's the reason why. I think, personally, one of the main reasons why you upgrade your camera in terms of camera system is so that you can fix white balance problems. You know, that could just be me, but I think generally that's what people tend to do. Is you want to have a sharper image, you want to have better coloring, but you also want to fix white balance along with better ISO performance. Those are the main things that people go after typically. And then, of course, you've got mechanics on top of that, such as frames per second, low light shooting capability, so on and so forth. Well, the Canon 6D actually hurts when it comes to low light shooting, not in the way of a shallow contrast / saturation setup that can hurt the camera. But when you start talking about weird lighting, or I want to say awkward lighting due to low lit situations or compromising lit situations, the Canon 6D completely falls straight through the floor. It falls through the floor the same way that I want to say the Canon T5i falls through the floor. Meaning that this camera does not perform any better in white balance capability than a baseline Rebel. Now this is a huge thing to understand because the Canon 5D Mark III actually does. So once again, when you look at it and you say, hey, for that extra $1,000 that I'm spending on that Mark III, what am I spending it on? Hey, that white balance corrector is partly what you're spending it on. It's one thing to sit up here and say, oh, I just think a camera's stupid. It's something else entirely for the camera to actually act stupid. One of the downfalls to the 6D is that the camera's actually prepped in a way in terms of its baseline architecture where the camera just tends to act not so smart. And the reason for this is because, unlike the Canon 5D Mark III, the Canon 6D in this situation clocks in under $1,000 below. Now, ultimately, this is a choice that everybody has to make, because what makes the Canon 6D so important in this conversation, the main thing that you got to walk away from in terms of understanding this camera is this. This is the camera that begins your investment into Canon if you go this route, a full frame. Understand, for Canon, this is the piece that locks you in. Because when you start investing in a full frame camera, the odds of you actually switching up from a full frame camera are pretty much second to none. Unless you end up scrapping the entire lineup of camera, meaning everything you've invested in the camera. The reason why this is important is because it comes down to understanding the gear that you have. And it comes down to understanding the investment that you're trying to make in a camera. If the idea is, oh, I want to have a better camera, then you have to look at how you're rating the concept of a better camera. Are you rating it on speed? Are you rating it on image quality? Are you rating it on mechanics? What is the thing that is allowing you to say this is a better camera? I think we've completely disproved the concept just because something's a full frame means it's a great thing. Because clearly the Canon 6D, in terms of its color management, in terms of its mechanics, and right down to its just baseline presentation here, is lack thereof. In fact, there's more consistency in overall craftsmanship in the Canon T5i for what it is at its $900 price point than the Canon 6D, which costs twice as much. Actually, a little over twice as much. So this is something that you guys want to keep in mind. Truthfully, what I would say is you really have to think about where you want to go. You have to look at the company, you have to look at how they're investing their technology, and you have to look at how their technology is playing out in the camera market. This is a prime example right here, where although Canon is saying, hey, guess what, we got a full frame for $2,000, oh, it's a great, beautiful thing. You can now be a full frame user as well. What are you actually getting for that $2,000? What are you getting as a trade-off to say that you own a full-frame camera? So that's what I have to say about it. Now, keep in mind, aside from this, I know people are going to sit up here and say, Doug, well, what about the lenses that Canon has, so on and so forth, and all of the above? Listen, I'm not saying not to go Canon. What I am saying is you better be thinking before you buy that Canon 6D. And quite frankly, if you want to go full frame, and if you want to make the investment in a Canon, then you got to sit up here and shell out that extra grand and go with that 5D Mark III. That's what you need to do. Otherwise, just stick with a T5i. Or maybe you'll really wise up and find yourself a Fuji. Anyways, you guys take care, and I'll talk to you later. All right, bye-bye.